So I hope I won't confuse you too much this morning with talk of the different European institutions. But before I begin my presentation, I should just explain a little bit the context of Europe that you may not see on a day-to-day basis with your dealings. I think for most of you, your main partner is the European Commission. And some people have the idea that the European Commission then has various small parts, such as the European Parliament. But this is not the case. Each are separate institutions, and as you'll see from my presentation, all the institutions come together in partnership on various issues, one of them being language technology. In particular, for language technology, it's not the whole institution that's coming together, but it's the part which is dealing with translation in particular. Okay? So, very briefly, what I'm going to talk about is I'll give you the background information about the cooperation that we have interinstitutionally. I'll tell you a little bit about how we work together. Then I'll spend quite a bit more time on the areas that we're dealing with. And finally, I have a few questions for you, the things that we need answered in the next few years, some of which we really don't have a clue what we're going to do about them and are going to cause us some huge problems. So, first of all, the confusing part. Interinstitutional cooperation is at various levels. So, as I said, it's the translation parts of each of the institutions. And we have a large committee, first of all, at the top, the Interinstitutional Committee for Translation and Interpretation. And what that brings together is all the different parts of the European institutions that deal not only with translation, but also with interpreting. We share some common needs, but we also have some very different needs as well. So the idea is that below that level, we have different committees, one dealing with translation, one dealing with interpreting. And within the translation part, we have two levels of organisation. I said it would be confusing. The first level is the executive level. This brings together the leaders of those directorates or those institutions. And the second level brings together the people that actually know what they're talking about. So we have two very different levels, the ones who can make the decisions and the ones who know which decisions should be made. Finally, below that, we have a series of projects, of tools that we're developing together, and also of networks. And the Interinstitutional Language Technology Watch is one of those networks. Okay, you've probably already forgotten all of that. I will come back to some of these things, but one of the things you'll notice is that within the European institutions, we love acronyms. So if you see some of the acronyms later that aren't clear, you have to bring your mind back to this slide. I'll try and remember to explain them as I go. So the sort of things that the Language Technology Watch is there to do is to really be a framework for all the activities that we're doing between the institutions. So that means we're looking at ways to structure the cooperative actions that we can take. The main one is really information flow. We have lots of people working in different areas, and we want to make sure that as far as possible we can share that information to really build on the expertise in the different institutions. In some cases, that means that we will see an area where really we can merge the efforts which are being made and have more permanent collaboration. Now, that permanent collaboration could take the form of a project, a software tool that could be developed, or it could simply be adding added value to the tools which are being produced within each institution. We also, one of the things we're really thinking about is we're not simply a producer of language technology or a consumer of language technology. We are very much both, and also we're a massive data resource. So we have part of every area that you will be taking on, and the sort of projects that you're producing now are the sort of things that will lead into what we're using in the future. But at the same time, we're looking at technologies around language that we're using today. And I think that's something which is quite a difference from the sort of things that we were talking about yesterday, is that we're not only looking at cutting-edge language technologies, but we're also, and mainly, looking at technology which is there to allow us to do our job better now. So when we're talking about translation, that's not just the job of actually translating a text, but there's a lot more around that as well. There's the job of producing a text which is suitable for translation. There's the job of finding a workflow which makes sure that everybody is involved, that the communication works at all stages. And of course, there's also the fact that some of the text that we get in may not be in a form that we can easily use. So how do we convert that from, for example, a handwritten PDF file to something which we can actually translate easily? So it's a broader context in a way than some of the things that we discussed yesterday. Okay, some of our members, just to give you an idea of how many institutions make up the family. The European Parliament, I'm sure you've heard of. Then we have the Council, the European Commission. In particular, we're talking about the Directorate General for Translation for the European Commission. Then we have the Court of Justice, the European Central Bank. I won't go through the whole list, but you can see them all there. One thing to note is that these are all very different institutions with very different sizes and in many cases very different needs. We all share the common goal to be able to produce the language that we're using in a multilingual environment. However, we do it in a very different way. If we take the one I just mentioned, the European Central Bank, for example, it just has 1 or 2 translators for each language, and it's working mainly from English. Whereas we take something like the European Parliament or the 2 committees that I work for, the European Economic and Social Committee and the Committee of the Regions, in our environment, we're working from every single language, official language of the European Union, into every other official language of the European Union and beyond. Now, the needs of a translation service there are very different, but we do share some common problems. So on to the mandate for the Language Technology Watch. The vision is to become a trusted forum for the exchange of information. That's the main idea. We want to identify the global developments, that means at places like this, and we need to find out which of those are relevant for our needs here and now, as well as in the future. So we want to pull the information together. We want to be able to forecast what technology is coming and how that will affect our work. And we need to make sure that not only do the experts in language technology within the institutions know about that, but also the translators, because they're all wondering how their job will be affected in the future. And not only them, but the people who have their hands on the money, because they're wanting to know, well, what are we getting out of this? How is all this technology helping us? And that's something which is one of the questions we have at the end. So the sort of things that we've been looking at over the last year and a half that we've been in existence. We've looked a little bit about quality assurance. I'll go through all of these in detail afterwards. XML authoring tools, machine translation I'm not going to talk about very much because Spiros will talk about that. Conversion from other formats, workflow tools, electronic dictionaries, teleworking, proofing tools, and terminology extraction. It's a very broad base. And as you'll see there, there's a huge difference between some quite advanced technologies and really some quite basic technologies that we still haven't worked out exactly how to best use. So let's go through each of these in turn. You'll notice in each of these slides, there's one of the institutions in the top right-hand corner. That's because for each project, we have a lead institution who have tried to make sure that we move forward in the area. So first of all, quality assurance. Obviously here we're wanting to find tools that will help us improve the internal consistency within a document. This is particularly important in an institution like my own, where we are producing documents commonly in 22 languages. Now, we're producing them in 22 languages and we don't have translators who can translate from 21 languages to another 22. So what in actual fact we're doing is we have a translation normally from one language into a PIVO language such as English, French and German, and then translated into the rest. So consistency at that level is very important. I mean, obviously you can't get a perfect translation which is perfectly equivalent in all those languages, but we need to get as close to that ideal as possible. So some of the things that we've been looking at, the Commission's investigated Error Spy and QA Distiller. We need to do more work in this area to find out how well these perform. However, we're sort of in standby mode on this because we're waiting for the current generation of CAT tools to be available. And that's something which has been ongoing for a couple of years. because it would appear that most of them provide quality assurance tools that may give us exactly what we need. The next one is something which is really before the text gets us, which is how do we try to limit the authors so that they produce something which we can easily translate. So here we're looking at the possibility of using XML authoring tools. This is already being done to a certain extent in the Parliament and the two committees, the European Economic and Social Committee and the Committee of the Regions. We're already working on having amendments to legislation or to opinions on legislation being put in electronically in quite a rigid form. Basically, this allows us to make sure that when we have a text which has already been translated, we can really make sure we can bring most of that in and only give the translator a very small job to do in looking at the changes in particular. Why that's important is because these amendments come in very quickly and have very short deadlines. So it's something which is very important to us to make sure that this works. To a certain extent, it's also the case with website content, trying to reduce the sorts of text which are being used there to make sure that the translations can be produced quickly. There's a lot more scope in this area, and I suspect that this is one which may not grow in the next couple of years, but maybe in 4 or 5 years, we might start having systems which allow an author quite a degree of freedom, but are actually producing a very structured text. The big one, machine translation. There's been an exchange of information on tests that have been carried out at the Commission and the Parliament. The Commission is working on its EESC system. I'm not going to say any more because if I do, I'll steal Spiros's thunder, which I don't want to do. So you'll have to wait a few minutes before you find out more about that. An area which is relatively simplistic, conversion from PDF. Now, in this case, we have tools available which can pretty much convert typewritten text into a form where we can translate them using the tools such as PDF Converter, Nuance Omnipage, ABI. However, we're also interested in, is there any way we can take handwritten text and get it into a form where we can translate it? That may seem a bit odd, but if you think of the sort of large administrations which we represent, one of the things that needs to be translated are things like doctor's notes, which are coming in. You may have seen a doctor's handwriting. It's not very easy to deal with, and we don't really have any tools that can deal with that at the moment. But if in the future that becomes available, that's something that would be very interesting. The next one is workflow tools. This really does step aside from the language technology and takes us into a technology which allows us to work with language. Each of the institutions has a very different workflow, which is odd really because we're basically doing the same job. So these are systems which have developed in-house over many, many years, most of them based on originally paper systems. And what we're looking at now in several of the institutions is to move forward to the next generation. Our cooperation here is based on an exchange of information, learning what we're doing and what we're doing differently and why we're doing it differently. And what we want to look at next is how we can take the lessons that we've learned from our individual systems and bring them together to either build new systems ourselves or perhaps to look at several of the institutions working together on a common workflow tool. Electronic dictionaries, we're not developing electronic dictionaries, we're looking at how can we best deliver electronic dictionaries to our translators, and also which electronic dictionaries should we deliver. The European Parliament's done a lot of work on this in particular. If you imagine a translator in our environment is commonly working with several languages in the Parliament and the committees, they might be working with 6 or 7 languages. So having all the dictionaries and resources available for those languages is actually quite a difficult thing to manage across all the translators. So that's something we're looking at how we can improve. Another thing which is becoming important to us now is teleworking. Most of the institutions already have some degree of teleworking. Others are just starting, like my own. And we started here with a survey on the current state of play, which we've completed. We looked at the technologies being used, and we looked at the limitations that they produce. It's not only a question of can you deliver all the tools which are available in the office, but how well do they work? One of the issues that we've seen is that we use a thin client, so that basically it's the screen and the keyboard which are with the translator and everything else is back at base, which under normal circumstances would be fine. However, one of the limitations of that system is that there's a slow update of the screen. Now, for most users, that wouldn't be a problem, but for translators, that's a real issue, because a lot of them are typing extremely quickly and reviewing what they've typed instantly, and so the system doesn't really deliver. So we need to have a look at how we can improve the situation there. For the proofing tools, for spelling and grammar, we've looked at the linguistic tools that are available in Microsoft Office 2007, 2010. Why? Because that's what we use. We haven't really looked further than that. But we're also interested in looking at how that can be used for the authors as well, not just for the translators. Terminology extraction, you may be aware of the project IATE, which is the term base available for the European institutions, which is also, for the most part, available publicly. We're also looking at ways that we can take the terminology which is within European documents and make that available for future translations. So we've looked at Xerox Term Finder, Terminix Synchroterm, STL Multi-Term Extract, Multicorpora, Multitrans, comparing these to see what are the advantages and disadvantages of each, to try and see which one will best suit our environment. And not only suit our environment, but where it should appear within the environment. And that's an overview of the areas that we're covering. So I just have one final slide, and really this is the one which I don't have the answers. I just have the questions. Where next? How do we best serve our new language combinations? We are looking at, Croatian may well come in soon. We're considering whether Icelandic will become an issue soon. Turkish. How do we integrate languages like that, new languages? Is there any way that we can more efficiently introduce Croatian, given that Croatian and Slovenia are quite similar languages? Could we apply such lessons to other languages such as Czech and Slovak? How do we cope with the constant increase in languages? At the moment, we're coping reasonably well with 23. Can we cope with 30? I think the answer is not the way we're working now. So we need to find new ways of working there. How do we manage multilingual source texts? Now, this is not a problem for most translators, but for those in the parliamentary assemblies, so in the parliament and in the committees, we very often get texts which are, for example, a text in English, where somebody has edited the text in French. So they take a sentence, they cross out a couple of words, they add a part in French, they cross out a different bit of the sentence. So you end up with quite a complex document. And with a document like that, current computer-aided translation tools just don't work. They don't even work when it's separate sentences, which are in different languages. But you put those sentences into a single language, and we just have to ignore the tools and do it by hand. How do we keep the translator's responsibility in a case where everything is being checked, especially when things are being checked by a computer? This is a problem, because we've been telling the translators, yes, you're a profession, you have professional responsibility. And then we're leading them by the hand and saying, we're going to check that all your numbers in your document are correct. We're going to check that all the dates in your document are correct using quality assurance tools. But at the same time, we can't allow the translators not to do that themselves. Because if they do, the tools won't always cope all the time. And we can get some very foolish and very embarrassing errors in documents because of that. Big question next. How to measure the impact of language technology on translation? And the real thing here is the financial impact. We spend a lot of money on language technology. We also spend a lot of money on translators. How do we measure that? We can measure the total amount, but we can't measure how much the technology is giving us. And finally, I'll just skip to the last question as I'm out of time. What's the role of the translator in the new technological environment? Are they still a translator? Are they simply a proofreader? This is the question our translators are asking now, and that's something which we really need to find an answer for them to keep them motivated. Okay, thank you very much.